Morning, everyone. I'm broadcasting from London today, as you can see. Um, Hope you're doing well. I have a new microphone that I'm using, and I'm hoping that this makes the sound a little bit clearer. And when we get our weekly visit from the gardener, it won't be as loud as it was. So hopefully that will help. Let me see what else is going on with the image. Yeah, I think we can add another light. I think we'll do that next time, but for today it should be fine. Okay, so hope you're doing well. Let's see, let's start with the information about the class, and then I'll take some time and see if there's any questions. So where is this? There we go. Cool. Okay, well, this is all stuff you saw last time, but I want to make sure that we go through it again just in case there's any questions. Probably the easiest way to get a hold of me, as we've discussed, is to do it by appointment through Zoom. We can schedule a Zoom meeting. That would be the easiest way. Send me an email first, and then we'll schedule something through Zoom. So that should work. The course requirements are just 2 multiple choice exams, 1 midterm, and then 1 final. The midterm will probably be at the end of week 3, when you would have a 2-day window, maybe over the weekend. We'll determine that to take the exam. And then the last exam would be during the 2-day window of finals weekend, or whatever that is called. All the exams, okay, no problem. I just realized I forgot to post some additional questions for today, but all the exams will have multiple choice format. You already saw an example of one of those questions earlier today. I'll post some other questions after the break. But we will go through another practice question today before the break as well. But anyway, getting back to the point here, it is an open book exam. You do need to study, however, because you will not have enough time to go ahead and look up the answer to each question, not even close to having enough time. So it's important you prepare for the exam. We'll talk more about that as it comes closer, of course. But you'll have, I don't know, whatever it is, 1.5 to 2 hours to take the exam. It'll be 60 multiple choice questions, more or less, and you'll be taking it online through Canvas, which I'm learning more about. We'll talk about in a second. The second exam is not cumulative. It is just based on the second half of the material, second half of the quarter's material, which of course is from lecture, book, and discussion sections. Okay, so I think have posted the lecture slides on Canvas. I think we've got that right. You can take a look and let me know if you don't have access to that. I've also posted the paper that was discussed, I believe, yesterday in your discussion section on echolocation and using whether you're moving or stationary and echolocating, whether there's an advantage of doing one over the other, which you learned about in your section and you will be tested on. None of the details in the paper, just the general concept. And what else do I want to say? Yeah, we'll post other stuff on the Canvas site as time goes on. Just various links and things like that to demonstrations, probably. Chuan might be posting some stuff as well from discussion section. And then as the exam approaches, we'll have a few practice questions that will be posted, but clearly your practice questions are also coming through the polling questions we're doing in class. And they're not even practice, they're real questions on the exam to make your life so much easier. I want to also be very clear about this. While it is an easy class in terms of, you're doing your exam online, you're getting some questions beforehand, you've got to do well, right? I mean, if everyone does really, really well, we don't need a curve, and, the range of 90 and above will be A, and 80 and above will be B, and all that kind of regular non-curved sort of grading if everyone does really well, which is typical for an online class like this. So it's important. Don't expect a curve unless there's, the whole class struggles. But we'll get some sense of that as the quarter goes on. Okay, let me see if there are any questions now. Hold on just a second. Let's see if I can. Yeah. Boy, we're a small class. Okay, I kind of expected this would happen when I said all the lectures would be recorded, but that's okay. Again, I encourage you to come and tell your classmates to come because there is this very clear research. People do better if they're there live in the class. They're more engaged. They're able to remember more. But I do understand, especially in the summer, things come up. You're welcome to do it both ways. But what I would recommend is coming to class during the live presentations and then maybe reviewing the videos to help you study. Okay, let's see if there's any questions right now from you folks about the exam or the details of the course or anything like that. Anybody have anything? No? All right. Well, please let me know as time goes on if you do end up having any questions. And then before we continue on the lecturing, there's one other thing I wanted to mention, and I don't know how relevant this will be to some of you who aren't psych majors, but hold on just a second here. Let me go to, yes. Yes, I think we're up here. Good. Yeah. So my lab is actually currently looking for research assistants to help us out in the summer. Now, if you're a psychology major, you might know about this, but even as a non-major, this might be interesting to you. We do research in the department. All the faculty are researchers. They publish in international journals. They get grants from National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. And my research in my laboratory has to do with perception. It is related to many of the things we'll be discussing in the class through the quarter. But right now we're doing a lot of research on face perception, on speech perception, and multisensory perception. And we're currently looking for folks that might want to join the lab and do research with us. And they can either do that for credit. They can get course credit and actually get a letter grade for that, or they just want to volunteer, and that's also a good thing to do because when it comes time to go apply to graduate school or go on the job market or whatever, it's nice to have worked in a laboratory so you can get a letter of recommendation from a professor that knows you from more than just a class. And that's why a lot of people like doing it. And it's also a lot of fun. So I'll just tell you a little anecdote that my son is actually doing this right now. He's an undergraduate at University of Illinois, and he's decided to be a psychology major. I think he wants to be a therapist like my wife is, and not like a professor like I am. But I told him the most important thing you can do as a psychology major is to join a laboratory. And he's just starting to do that this coming quarter, and he's got an interview with a alcohol and behavior laboratory. It's just a really, really important thing to do, regardless of whether you want to be a psychology. If you're a psychology major, particularly regardless of whether you want to be a clinician or go into research or whatever, to have that experience to work closely with other undergraduates doing research, to work closely with a graduate student and get to know a professor outside the context of class. There are so many benefits to it. It's also a fun time. You get to meet other students that are interested in psychology and are working on projects with you. And very often you get to do presentations on campus and sometimes off campus at nearby conferences. And so it benefits everybody. So we're looking for folks, but if you're not particularly interested in our research, that's no problem. There's lots of other labs in the department that are looking for research assistants. And if you're too busy this summer, perfectly understandable. I recommend that for the folks that are in psychology, considering psychology as a major, that you do look for a laboratory to join in the fall or the spring or winter, I guess. Okay, are there any questions about that? Does anybody have any questions about laboratory work? Okay, speaking to the folks that are going to be watching this on video, there's the information. Go ahead and contact Serena or contact other labs when you have a chance if you're interested. Okay, somebody raised their hand. That's wonderful. Let me go ahead and make sure I can see everybody. Yes, Jacqueline.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is there any previous knowledge that we should be familiar with in order to apply for this research assistant position?
Great question. No, not at all. Preference is given to students who are doing well, who are, interested in psychology. And one thing I should say is if you're a like late semester senior, if you're planning on graduating in January, we like to have folks for more than one quarter. But beyond that, no, we just want people who are interested and enthusiastic and want to get involved in research. You don't need to have any previous courses. I guess the only issue right now, I'm sure we'll take people who are just interested for the summer. But if we have a lot of applications, sometimes we do in the fall. A lot of students want to get involved. Sometimes, if students have had the methods course or something, or psychology majors versus non-majors, we'll give them a little preference. But beyond that, we just want people who are excited. That's it. Who want to do research. So great question, and the answer is, at least for our laboratory, we're open to all students regardless of their background and their experience. Other questions about this? Again, if you're a psychology major, if you're considering being a psychology major or, quote, minoring in psychology, having kind of a secondary major, this is something I really recommend. If you're a biology major too, I recommend that you do. Sometimes we have neuroscience students and biology students taking this class. I recommend you do it in whatever department your major is in. Okay. Cool. All right, then we will continue with our lecture. Just to remind everybody, let me go ahead and put my image back up big size. Okay, let's go back to where we were. Yeah, good. Let's see. Yeah. So let's look at the big picture. The really big picture of the course is about understanding perceptual skills that we're unaware of having, and doing so through meeting individuals who've fine-tuned those perceptual skills for a variety of reasons. We've already talked about a blind individual who's fine-tuned his sense of hearing, Daniel Kish, in order to navigate using echolocation. So there's a compensation for a sensory loss, and we'll be talking a lot about those individuals. But in just a few minutes, we'll be talking about individuals who've learned to fine-tune their sense of hearing for purposes of their job, working on film and TV, and having to really kind of pick out the nuances of the acoustic space they're recording for film and TV. So we'll be learning about these kind of hidden perceptual skills for meeting individuals like that. And then, of course, along with that, we'll be learning some kind of very general concepts that are modern concepts in perceptual psychology and brain science that these demonstrations really help explain, or I guess exemplify, and that will kind of be introductions to concepts in the field beyond just the kind of cool experiences that we're learning about. And what we started, the first example we discussed was echolocation, and learning about what Daniel Kish can do and other expert echolocators can do. And we learned a little bit about the kind of acoustic structure that supports those skills. And we learned about maybe how the expert's brain reacts to sound in a way as if it's almost being seen, right? The visual areas of the brain are activated in expert echolocators, even though it's sound. And that's kind of a nice demonstration of the brain kind of, not really caring that much about sensory modality, but caring about the dimensions of the world that are outside, right? So the visual areas are maybe sensitive to spatial dimensions of perception, not just as it can be apprehended from vision, but also through sound. Okay, then we kind of talked about the kind of specifics about echolocation and whether it's important to use one's own sound for echolocation. And we kind of concluded, yeah, it helps to use your own sound. Daniel Kish likes to make his own sound when he's echolocating, and people tend to be better at it when they're using their own sound. But like how we might use a flashlight, we can see what's in a room not just by using our own flashlight, by using somebody else's flashlight. That is also true of echolocation. We can use sound reflection information, even if the initial emitted sound is not our own. Okay, so we kind of have changed our understanding over the last class of echolocation from kind of a sonar system where we're always comparing our emitted sound to reflected sound to much more of a kind of what we called ambient acoustic sort of situation where the emitted sound isn't really doesn't have to come from ourselves for us to have this information. That the real point here is that our brains are very sensitive to reflected sound that's reflected from different objects in a room, from walls, from the dimensions of the room, regardless of where the initial sound comes from, regardless of whether it's us making the sound, a friend making the sound, the quiet ventilation sounds in a room. Doesn't really matter that much. And that then is going to have implications for as I said before, TV and film sound. Okay, so that's how we're moving on here. We're kind of moving from our initial introduction to echolocation to understanding our general sensitivity to reflected sound. Okay, and here's where I think things get really fun, because we are going to start discussing how sound is important in Hollywood. Right. So, it's probably maybe it's been a while since you've been to a movie theater. I know it's been a while for me. In fact, I think the last time I was in a movie theater, tickets were just a little bit above $10 a seat, at least here in LA. Now I know they're $20 or more. So it's been a few years for me. But even at home theater, sound is pretty good when we're watching movies. Certainly at a movie theater, that with the speakers all around us, we have a really kind of immersive experience from sound. And it's something that the Hollywood puts a lot of money into, and not only, as I said, not only for theater sound, but also for home sound. Now that people are listening to 5-channel, kind of surround sound with speakers behind them. But even without that, I listen to sometimes TV with headphones on, so I'm not bothering my wife in bed when she's reading. And I am so aware with listening through headphones to regular, kind of streaming shows, that a lot of effort goes into kind of creating a space for the scene to take place in, which you not only see, but you also hear. And this is a very important component of how TV shows and movies are produced. Much more important than I kind of, as a person who studies sound, I kind of always knew it was an important consideration. But after I interviewed these individuals, talked to many folks that work on sound and TV and movies, I had no idea that so much energy and money goes into this. Because what they're really after is something that the camera folks, the lighting folks, special effects folks are after all the time, and that is keeping the audience in the scene. So what does that mean? Well, it means that not only should you be watching, something happening on the screen, but there's an element where they want you to feel like you're almost together with the characters in the scene, right? That, yeah, you're watching a two-dimensional image, moving image on a screen that is separate from you, but they want you to feel more immersed in that. And especially in a theater, this is the case, right? So they want the theater to kind of become an extension of the scene space. regardless of whether they're, camera folks or special effects folks, and sound folks is what we're going to be caring about now. So they try to, that they want the lighting to be driven by the scene, which is why it's completely dark in the theater. They want, your experience of the lighting of the scenes to be, your only experience of lighting. They want the camera work to be, done consistently, so you're, generally seeing the characters from the same side. All these little tricks to kind of make you feel like you're there, to the degree that you can do that. And that's especially true with sound, as we'll see. Um, they're also aware that any little glitch, any little, kind of distraction will make the audience feel less engaged. Now, what they'll say, in fact, is like if you're watching a movie in a theater and all of a sudden you lose your concentration, you kind of get distracted by something in the real theater space rather than what's going on the screen, or you start thinking about something else, they will say that it's probably because there was a mistake in the film. So any little glitch can take the audience out of the scene, meaning that they'll start, attending to something else going on around them in the theater or something like that. And they'll say that even if you're not aware of that glitch, your unconscious brain is taking in that information and maybe reminding you that you're watching a movie rather than you're there with the characters, right? Now, again, don't get me wrong. We always know we're watching a movie, but it's the experience of, being engaged and following what's going on in the story, and, feeling like, we're surrounded by the sound of the scene and that sort of thing, right? If you get distracted from that, you have less of an immersed experience. And they say that often when that happens, it's because a mistake was made in the movie, not necessarily something is going on in the theater, right? So yeah, obviously, if there's back in the early days of cell phones, people would forget to turn them off, turn off the ringers, and so ringers would go on all the time in a movie theater. Fortunately, that doesn't happen anymore. People would even answer the phone and start talking in the movie theater. It took us as a culture a while to get used to, the social rules with that. But these days, people are much better. People, you're not typically distracted. You might be distracted if you're seeing the Minions movie. You might be distracted by kids or something like that. But for the most part, people are, polite and quiet. But the glitches in the movie is what these, professionals care about. So here's one of my favorite terrible movies. I don't know if you're familiar with the director Ed Wood. There was a movie by Tim Burton with Johnny Depp in it, in the, I think, late 90s, called Ed Wood. And it was a story about the true director who was considered the worst director in film history. And worse in the sense that he would make really, really cheap movies, and not really care if there were little glitches in them, and the acting was pretty bad and all that. But they are really, they're fun movies to watch. Just because they're, kind of so low budget and kind of fun and silly. But, he was really he was known mostly for the glitches. And here's a scene from one of his movies, Plan 9 from Outer Space, I believe it's called. And as you look at this, you can see a glitch almost immediately in this. First of all, it's a very cheap looking set, right? It's supposed to be a cockpit from an airplane. And it doesn't look very much like that at all. But look towards the top of the set there. You can see there's a shadow of one of the microphones that's being used to record the dialogue. And he never cared about that sort of thing. And if you watch Plan 9 from Outer Space, sometimes you'll see that one of the actors might hit, a piece of the set, and the whole set will start shaking, but he didn't care about that. But this is kind of a very kind of conspicuous example of how a glitch in the film production can make you very aware that you're watching a movie, and you kind of get out of the scene for a second. So what we're concerned with here, though, is sound. And what these folks, these professionals that I interviewed were most concerned about is how the soundtrack must match the scene. Now, what I mean here by soundtrack is not really music. That we'll be talking about movie music later, if not today, next week. But I'm talking about the recording of the dialogue, of course, the special effects, some of which for sound are very elaborate, but others just involve making sure that if somebody's walking, you hear the footsteps correctly. The soundtrack must match the scene, and when it doesn't, you end up having problems. So when I was a kid, you had to get used to poorly dubbed films, right? So a lot of these Japanese monster movies were filmed with Japanese actors and speaking Japanese, and then they would have American actors come in and dub the soundtrack, and they just nothing. The lips never matched up with the sound that you were hearing, the dialogue you were hearing, and it was very conspicuous. And they didn't care too much now. Now, when I know that Netflix has a lot of foreign films, right? So if you watched Squid Games, the dub version, maybe you noticed a problem with the dubbing. I have trouble watching dub films now. I have to use the subtitles. But if you watch the dub version, maybe you noticed every once in a while that things didn't match up. And when that happens, you're kind of taken out of the film. You're taken out of the scene, right? You're more aware that you're watching a movie than if that didn't happen. Okay, but that's a very conspicuous example. What we're going to be talking about today mostly are situations in which the space the actors seem to be in, based on what you're seeing, doesn't match the space you're hearing them perform in. Okay, so we're not going to be talking much about poor dubbing when it comes to lips and sounds and speech sounds. We're going to be talking about the space instead. So this is one of the lessons that Hollywood has taught us, I think, that we are exquisitely sensitive to the how rooms structure sound. Okay, that's the first thing. This is something that after talking to these folks, I think we can really conclude. So the folks I interviewed, just to give you an idea, are, they are well-known sound engineers, recording engineers for TV and movies, but they worked on film and TV shows that are very typical, right? It's not like they were working on films that were so big budget they had to do things very elaborately. These were, regular, I guess, moderate budget films. But I'm going to tell you, I'm telling you that just so you know that the effort they put in to really get the sound right is very typical for most movies and TV shows these days. So what I've learned is that that typically when they are filming a scene, the visible space that one sees during the filming does not match the space's acoustics. Here's what I mean by this. The visible spaces and audible spaces do not match typically. But they must match, according to these folks, in order for you to be consistently in the scene, to be consistently engaged with the scene. So I have a way of demonstrating this here. This is just a little set that's being filmed. It looks like maybe it's a bedroom scene or something that would be filmed for a TV show. I can't see what it is exactly, but it's a small area that's going to be filmed for a scene between a few characters in a small space, a depicted space. However, the space that it's being recorded in is typically much bigger than what's going to be seen in the film. This is what the space looks like. Now, it's like an airplane hangar, right? If it is a studio. If you've done any studio tours in Hollywood, you know that these sound stages are immense. They're just humongous. And that's great because it allows them to use props and set up multiple scenes in the studios and all that sort of thing. But it causes a real problem for sound, Because while the scene that's being filmed will be depicting a very small space, the sounds that are heard based on that space could make it sound like it's in a cavern, right? If you were to walk into that space and say hello, you'd hear echoes. You would sound like you're in an airplane hangar, right? Imagine going in there and clapping your hands. You'd hear clap, 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 right? You'd hear those echoes. And so this is a problem, right? That the scene's depicted space visually, okay, is going to be very different from how the dialogue would normally sound recorded in an area that large, right? So somehow these sound engineers, these sound recorders, need to make the recording of the dialogue sound like it's in a much smaller place than it's actually being recorded in. Somehow the acoustic space must be modified. And that's the first thing these sound recorders, these sound mixers do. So I'm going to introduce you to your first sound teacher here, Jay Patterson. And he's what's called a sound mixer, but he does a lot more than just kind of balancing the sounds of the recording. He's responsible for putting the microphones in the appropriate places. He's responsible for making sure, which we're most interested in, making sure the recorded space, the sound space matches the scene space. And I talked to him about how he does that in particular. And he said, well, wait, what you need to understand is that every space has an acoustic signature, right? The space you're in right now, whether you're in your bedroom or your living room, your garage like I am, it has an acoustic signature. It has a way that it's actually shaping the sounds that are existing in the room. In my garage, the most prominent sound obviously is my voice, right? In your room, it might be the fan behind you, the ventilation, maybe just your clothes rustling together. But even with those quiet sounds, the room is shaping how those sounds are reaching your ear, okay? And that's specific to the room you're in at the time. So here's what he does to determine the acoustic signature of a room he needs to, or a studio he needs to record in. He comes in, according to him, he's been doing this so long that he only needs to do this once. He comes into the middle of the room, say that space that we just saw on the previous slide, that set, okay, and claps once like that, okay? Just one clap, he says, will usually do it. And he'll have a sense immediately of how he needs to modify that space so that the heard dialogue will match the scene space. Okay, so a single hand clap provides that necessary reflective structure that he's going to have to modify in order for it to match. Okay, so let's just go back here just to give us an intuition on this. So he would go into this space, right? Go into the scene here. Does this work if I do that? Hopefully you're seeing this arrow here, okay? And would make a single clap sound right there in the middle of the set. Now, when he does that, we know clearly it's gonna be a loud, very kind of echoey sort of clap. But he knows that the film space is this little bedroom here, and it's got to sound like a bedroom. So he needs to somehow modify this space so it sounds smaller than the actual studio it's in. Okay, right? All right, there he is. So how does he do that? Well, what he'll do is he'll bring in what's called baffles and blankets, acoustic blankets, and you're looking at those sort of things right there. It's not important, you know the details. But what that does is it quiets the space, right? It actually makes it less echoey in the case that we're talking about today, right? So yeah, those are acoustic blankets and baffles. I'll show you a picture of the baffle. We have been looking at one actually. There's a baffle, yeah, right on the top here. This actually is providing light to the scene to some degree, but importantly, it's also got material on it, so it's making the sounds that are going to be emanating in this space less echoey, right? The sounds aren't going to be going all the way to the top. They're going to be stopped by this hanging baffle here. I'm assuming you can see that, my arrow. Oh, okay, this will do it. Yeah, from now on, I'll just do it over here because it shows up on both screens. So this is the baffle I'm talking about right here, this hanging thing, okay? So he would put that there as well as blankets around the set. And he needs to do it quickly, I should say. He needs to do it while they're setting up the lighting for the scene, when they're setting up the cameras. He has to do it very quickly. And of course, he has to put these blankets and baffles in places that are not visible to the camera or block the lighting or something like that. So this is what makes him a real professional. It's not an easy thing to do. He's got a lot of constraints. He needs to work quickly, and he needs to know exactly where these things are going to be best situated in order to shape now the acoustic space so it sounds like the scene should look. And then what he does is, after he sets those up, he puts microphones all around the set. He puts them on the floor. He puts them maybe on the walls, right? And what he's trying to do is, yes, he wants to get good fidelity of whatever dialogue might be going on in the scene or something like that. But he also wants that dialogue to be shaped by the baffles and blankets he's put there, and for that shaping to be captured in the recording, in the audio recording. Okay, so multiple microphones are positioned to capture now this restructured acoustic space, which is pretty cool, right? And he's wonderful at it. If you watch one of his movies, or I'm not sure what you'd be familiar with. He worked on, when I was interviewing him, he was working on Without a Trace, which was a TV show that was on a long time. I don't know if it's in reruns anymore. But it was a very popular show. It was, kind of like Law and Order type of thing, but he said he had to do this all the time because, they did a lot of, there were a lot of scenes in the studio where they were showing people in an office. But this, because it was one of these gigantic sound stages, if he didn't come in and modify the set with his blankets and his baffles, it would sound like they were talking in a gymnasium or an airplane hangar, even though the scene was showing a small office space. And they would also do a lot of things on location, if they wanted to, go to do some filming in, say, a wealthy, mansion or something like that. They wouldn't typically, set that up on the set if they're just going to be using it once. They would actually, rent somebody's house out, and the same thing would need to be done there with baffles and blankets and all that sort of thing, and all the microphones. And he absolutely, said that, he feels, and everybody who works in the field feels, that if this is not done, if there is this very conspicuous mismatch between what is heard and what is seen, people won't have the experience of being engaged in the show or the movie or whatever. It is a really critical part of the production of a TV show, whether it's an expensive TV show or whether it's not, whether it's a soap opera or something like that. It's an important thing to do. Okay, more examples of this. I'm going to introduce you to another sound professional from Hollywood, and his name is Sandy Berman, and he's what's called a sound designer. And what he would do is take the recordings that Jay Patterson and his group would make, and then kind of sit down and potentially add sound effects to it, even the very simple sound effects of footsteps or something like that. And also what he would be responsible for is having the actors come back, and sometimes they'll have to come back and re-record their dialogue. Okay, there's names for these two things, and I'll get them down for you. I think I do refer to them in the book, and it's important you know the terms just so if you see them on the exam, you'll understand what's meant by them. Foley is just the kind of simple sound effects that are added to a film. And looping is when they bring in the actors to redub their dialogue. Now, there's lots of reasons that might happen. You know, if especially if they're going like on location, if they're leaving the studio and recording, whether it's outside recording in a park or something like that, whether it is at somebody's house, a mansion or something like that. There are many times that the dialogue isn't clear enough, or they don't notice it when they're recording the dialogue, but there's an airplane that's going overhead. So typically an actor always has to come back and re-record some of the dialogue from a TV episode or a movie. It rarely occurs that that's not the case. And that's the sort of thing that Sandy Berman would be responsible for. By the way, he's also responsible for, he doesn't write the music or produce the music, but he's responsible for putting the music into the soundtrack to make sure it's at right, you know, it's at the right balance with the dialogue and the action and all that sort of thing. Okay, but what we're most interested in here is the Foley and especially the looping, because think about what might happen when he brings the actors back to the studio to record the dialogue. It is in a studio and not in the original set or on location place that the dialogue was recorded in, right? So imagine, okay, I'll play George Clooney, all right, because I personally think I look a little like him. I'm kidding. All right. What did I just see? Okay, Ocean's 11. I just saw this. It was on TV, and it was a, you know, kind of just surfing, and it's a kind of fun movie to watch if, you know, it's just kind of, you're just kind of laying around on a Sunday, right? I assume many of you have seen it, right? It's kind of old, but, you know, it's on all the time. Okay, so here I'm George Clooney, and I recorded a scene. Originally, it was filmed in a hotel room, a Vegas hotel room, right, where I'm planning out my little caper with Brad Pitt and Matt Damon and all those famous actors. Right? Okay. But I didn't know this, but while they were filming one of my lines, an airplane was going by the hotel where it was being filmed in. And so Sandy calls me up and says, George, I'm sorry, but we're going to have you come back in for some additional looping. And, you know, being the gentleman I am as George Clooney, I say, oh, it's no problem. I expect it. And so I come back to his studio to do the looping. So here's the issue. When looping, by the way, it's called looping, just so you know, it's kind of a weird name for redubbing dialogue, right? Oh, I see somebody had a question, it looks like. Hold on, I'm sorry. Is there previous knowledge we should be familiar with in order to this be? Yeah, okay, so Jennifer asked a question too. Would this be open for the fall? Yes, we are going to be looking for research assistants in the fall. And I already answered Jacqueline's question. Good, okay, no problem. Sorry, I didn't notice those until just now. Going back to my George Clooney, pretending I'm George Clooney. Okay, the reason it's called looping is this. All right, so I have to be brought back to the studio, and what I'll do is I'll sit down in a chair with headphones on typically, and a microphone in front of me, and I'll be watching a big screen, and I'll see on that screen a video or a film of me saying the line that I now need to repeat so it's made clear. And it's called looping because I see that over and over again. That kind of helps me kind of with my timing. So, you know, say, we've got to, you know, I don't know, we've got to go into the vault without anybody seeing us or something like that. And it didn't come out good because there was a plane going overhead. So I look at that, say, we got to go out into the vault without being noticed. We've got to go into the vault without being noticed. And I'll keep saying that so I can match up my new utterance of the dialogue with the film that's already been made of my face saying that. That's why it's called looping. It's done over and over and over again. Okay, so that's what Sandy is responsible for. And it's, you know, it's a little bit of a pain for the actors, but they understand it's part of the job. Okay, here's the issue though. When I originally, as George Clooney, said that line on the set in the Las Vegas hotel room, I said it in an acoustic space that was specific to that room. Okay. But now I'm in Sandy Berman's studio, and the acoustics of that studio are completely different. So when I'm now recreating that line, that's going to be kind of merged with all the other dialogue that was recorded in that space. It could all of a sudden sound like I'm speaking in a different room, even though it's showing my face clearly in the same room as the other lines. But it's conspicuous enough, and you can listen to this, and I'll give you an example of how you can listen to this in just a second. It's conspicuous enough that you are distracted by it, unless the kind of the reflected acoustics of Sandy's studio is corrected, so it sounds like the acoustics of that room. Okay. So how is that done? He has a number of different methods. And he says the method he uses will depend on how much money the film has, what the budget is for the film. He has to correct it no matter what. Say it's a kind of less expensively made, I don't know, what a soap opera is, or maybe I guess there's some streaming shows that have less of a budget. Maybe the first season of a kids streaming show or something like that. They don't have a lot of budget, and if that's the case, what Sandy would use is something called room tone recordings. Let me get that down. Yeah, room tone recordings of a set. And let me tell you how this is done. Kind of a clever, and this has been used forever. They have, kind of fancier ways of doing it now, but, for the last, say, 30 years, it's been done this way. Room tone recordings are basically recordings of the quiet set where the film is originally being filmed. Okay, so for Ocean's 11 and George Clooney, after we perform that scene, me, George, and Matt Damon and Brad Pitt and all the other famous folks, after it was filmed and the director felt like it was a good enough take, that he had what he needed to put the thing together, he would say, okay, room tone recording, everybody, room tone recording. What we would do as actors is stand just where we were when we were performing this scene. And they would bring out this special microphone, looking like something like this, actually an array of microphones, looking like that, and put it in the middle of the room and record essentially a full minute of silence. Okay, we would not move, we would just stand still, kind of daydream. Probably you can look at your phone, whatever, but it's a minute. What it's doing is it's recording kind of the quiet ambient sounds of the room along with the reflected structure that room is giving. Okay, so you're basically making what would seem like a silent recording, but now it's not really silent. There are always these quiet sounds in the room, and more importantly for our purposes, these quiet sounds are being structured by where the walls of the room are and the furniture, there's probably carpeting in the room, right? Those quiet sounds are being structured by all of these different reflecting surfaces, and these room tone recordings are actually, being captured in this way. And then what would happen is those probably, somebody like Jay Patterson would make those room tone recordings and then give them to Sandy. And what Sandy would do is take those recordings along with my George Clooney's reading of that line, okay, and add it to it, okay, so that it didn't sound like that specific line was recorded in a different space, but it now sounds a little bit more like the space that the line was originally recorded in, where it's being depicted in the film, okay? That's room tone recording, and it's a very inexpensive way to try to make a looped or a re-recorded line sound like it was actually recorded in its original space. All right, it works okay. It doesn't work perfectly because as I speak this line, I'm not actually creating the reflectances of that room, but it works okay. If he's got a little more money, he does this. Something called worldizing, and this is just this is just amazing. Sandy worked on a movie. I guess the movie that he had just finished when I interviewed him back in 2010 was something called, gosh, what was it called? I can't remember the specific name. El Cantanto or El Canto Encanto. Now I know there's an animated movie that came out more recently with some similar title, but this was a movie, maybe some of you have seen it, with Jennifer Lopez and Mark Anthony. I guess it's where they met in her, one of, for one of her many hundreds of marriages, whatever. No, just kidding. But he had just worked on that, and it was a movie about a singer. I think it's about Jennifer Lopez as a singer, and her love affair and marriage to Mark Anthony's character. And he gave me an example of what worldizing is from this film. The marriage scene, maybe you folks know this, I've never seen it, but the marriage scene where the wedding takes place and the wedding reception takes place was down in Mexico, maybe Mexico City, on a, like, kind of in oh, how would you call this? A patio, a large patio that was in some location in the city. And it was a very old kind of patio plaza, I guess we'll call it, setting, with very, very kind of old, beautiful ceramic tiles, not only on the ground, but also on the walls of this plaza that went up quite high, he said. And he said, that's a really unique acoustic space. You can imagine, right? All these tiles are going to reflect sound in a very, very unique way. So anyway, he went down there and helped the filming with it. But then when he came back, he realized that some of Jennifer Lopez's lines didn't record well. Maybe there was, a car going by outside or something like that. So he needed to have her come back into the studio to re-record the lines. Okay. They had a bigger budget, so they didn't need they had access to more than just these room tone recordings. They decided just to record Jennifer Lopez's lines in the studio, just her saying the line over and over again until they got one that they liked. And then they took this recording, get this, they took this recording and flew back down to Mexico, to the plaza that the scene had originally been filmed in, and used a recording of her line being spoken through loudspeakers that were put back in that plaza. So essentially, they didn't want poor Jennifer Lopez to have to go back and, she was already working on new projects. But instead they did the next best thing, which was take a recording and replay it in that space and then record it again. So they had essentially Jennifer Lopez's lines coming out of the loudspeaker, bouncing off all these wonderful tiles in the plaza and recording the line that way, and then going back and then kind of putting it together with the original recording. So that's what he called worldizing. And I guess that's the kind of technical name for that, which seems, when I heard these things, I mean, I know what you're thinking too. It's like, oh my gosh, no wonder tickets for movies are so ridiculously expensive now, right? This is, this is a really kind of elaborate, kind of maybe unnecessary sort of thing to do, that we're, as an audience, we're paying for this type of detail to be recreated. But you talk to these guys, you talk to Sandy, you talk to Jay Patterson, you talk to everyone I mentioned in the book, and they all say the same thing. It's like, if we didn't make it that good, there's a good chance you would be distracted in the theater, or be distracted when you were listening at home over your very nice sound system. And we don't want that to happen. We don't want you distracted. We don't want you leaving the scene. So for us, it's worth it. You'll like the movie more. You'll tell your friends you like the movie more, and reviewers will like the movie more if they're not disengaged continuously through the movie. Okay, so they say it's worth it for them. I thought, at that point, if they're doing things so elaborately that it won't, it's costing so much money to do this sort of thing, they must be doing it for each other, kind of to win awards and be nominated and all that sort of stuff. They said, no, this really has they said that this sort of sound replication probably has a stronger bearing on your engagement than any other mistake we can make. Right. Okay. All right. Fine. He said that that's not even the best thing. Flying back down to the set in Mexico City isn't even the most elaborate thing we can do, an accurate thing we can do, for various reasons. He said I'm just going to talk about this quickly. There's a way of electronically doing it now, called convolution. And basically what that involves, and this is really not the most important component of this, but what convolution involves is actually doing the whole thing through a computer simulation. So when Sandy's down in the plaza for the original recording with everyone there, he will take measurements of that space, literal, tape measurements, as well as take photos of all the different surfaces that are in that space. And then after everybody leaves, what he'll do is he'll make recordings of, him clapping, or maybe a computer making a sound, and he'll use those recordings to analyze through a computer. And then there are ways of getting the computer to actually simulate that space. So you can take that new dialogue, that loop dialogue from Jennifer Lopez, and put it through the simulation. He says at least in 2010, he didn't think the technology was quite there. I have to admit, I have not followed this technology. It could be that it has worked wonders now and it works well, but he said that it's just coming out. He said that his favorite way of doing it, and his way of doing it, if in fact he has an unlimited budget, is to actually rebuild the set in his studio. Okay, so he prefers to actually recreate the acoustic space. So what does that mean? Before they bring Jennifer Lopez in to to loop her dialogue, what he would do is spend a week or so trying to recreate the size and surfaces of that plaza that her lines were originally recorded in. Now, it obviously doesn't need to look exactly like it, right? It doesn't need to be the same color tile or anything like that. But he would bring in ceramic tiles and kind of, at least in some locations, make sure that they were there facing the same direction relative to where she stood when they did the original filming. Okay, and they'd bring in walls, and if there was a lot of clutter, like with chairs or something during the scene, they would bring in all these chairs, and then they would bring her in and have her record the scene, because then they're recreating enough of the space to get really a very, very good simulation of how the recording was originally made, the space the recording was originally made in. Of course, he'll use the same types of things. Again, it doesn't have to be seen, so it really just has to capture the acoustic space. Most of how they do this is through listening and measurements, of course. They'll use the measurements they took when they were down there, but they'll also listen and say, okay, is this enough do we need to bring more of this ceramic tile in to make her sound more like she did when she was in the space? Be a lot of listening to detail and that sort of thing. This perceptual expertise helps here. And they'll bring in the baffles and blankets that Jay Patterson uses to really sculpt the space so it sounds almost exactly like the original space. And he said, this is the way to do it. There's nothing like the real thing, he said. You can do this, you can fly back down there and play a loudspeaker, play J-Lo's voice through a loudspeaker and hope for the best. But he said, if we're bringing her back in, we might as well recreate the space as best we can. And that's going to be the best thing to keep the audience engaged, which is pretty cool. Now, this is just an aside. You're not going to be tested on this, but I just wanted to give you a sense, just to maybe show that it's not just these sound engineers that care about this sort of thing. Sandy said something about what he called the looping problem. Oops, I guess I took it out of this slide. Okay, I already mentioned it. That's fine, it's not going to be on the test, but the looping problem is, and again, not on your test, don't worry about it, is that when the actors come in, okay, and they have to say their line, they are typically wearing headphones. right? And yes, they're listening to their line, but being spoken. But very often it's recorded, that line is recorded from a microphone that was on their body, which didn't really capture the space very well. So when they're listening to their own lines, they're not hearing the space in which they were speaking. And there are actors, and he gave me a list of some famous actors, more my generation. Robert Duvall, you familiar with him? He was in the Godfather films. As an example, that Robert Duvall can't use the headphones because when he's doing this looping, because he says that it's too sterile. His voice is too sterile, and when he hears his voice that sterile because of the close-up microphones, he doesn't feel the same kind of emotion he did when he was actually originally performing the scene, when he has to re-perform the scene back in the studio. So it seems it's not just the sound engineers and directors and producers that feel like this is so important, but the actors too. They can hear the difference between this. Now, here's one of the disappointing things about doing this remotely, because I have a really nice example, but we realized that you would be able to hear the difference in. But when I tried to do this last time through a Zoom, it didn't work. I needed to show oh, you know what it is? I think Zoom is very suspicious when you're showing a copy protected DVD, okay? So it didn't work. I mean, when I tried to plug in the DVD and show it through Zoom, Zoom said, nope, you can't watch this. All right, so sorry about that. But here's what I usually do when I'm teaching this live, is I show a DVD, a scene from a DVD called Mary Poppins. Maybe some of you saw this when you were a kid. There was a newer version. The original movie was in the 1960s when I was a kid. But then there was a newer version with, what's her name? I can't remember her name now, but it was nice too. But I showed the original version. The reason I show the original version is this. I show the scene first. It's just a scene in the living room of the family that Mary Poppins is coming to help. Emily Blunt, there's the name. Okay, but this is the early one. This is the one with Julie Andrews. Anyway, I show a scene where she's in the living room talking to the father of the family. And I don't know if you remember the story, but they're a very well-off family. He's a banker, and they have a very nice living room with a lot of marble floors and kind of tall walls. They're very tall rooms, and they're talking. This is a very quick scene, maybe 3-minute long scene. They're talking. It sounds perfectly fine. And then what I do about halfway through this scene is I switch it to the Spanish dialogue channel, okay, or this French dialogue channel. So DVDs have this, I believe. Most Netflix shows now allow you to do this as well. But the DVD is nice because of the way it kind of clicks back and forth. When I switch it to the Spanish channel, okay, yes, you hear Spanish and you see the actress's lips moving for English words. So yes, you do see there's a little discrepancy there. It's fine. It's nicely done, so it's not too terrible. But more than that, what you hear all of a sudden when you switch it to the Spanish channel is everything about the sound of that scene becomes completely sterile. Right? It all of a sudden sounds like they're kind of floating in space or something like that, because their voices sound disembodied almost, the voices of the characters. And that's because, especially back then, when they would record the dub dialogue, they would just bring the Spanish actors into the studio and put a mic in front of them and have them in a very quiet space in the studio. And that is what you hear. So clearly you wouldn't hear any of the kind of sound reflections that very distinct room, the marble floors, the high ceilings, that room with a very distinct acoustic signature wouldn't get kind of simulated in the recording of the foreign spoken language channels. And so when you go back, when I do this demonstration in class, you go back and forth between hearing the original recording in that space and then hearing the Spanish dialogue channels. It's not just that you hear a difference in the language, but you hear a difference, like whenever you go to the Spanish language, it's all of a sudden it seems like the space gets smaller. It's, you're still seeing the same space, but it seems like, the voices aren't being spoken in that space. And when you go back and forth like that, it becomes very, very obvious, these things that all these sound engineers and producers and directors and actors are concerned about. So, you'll have to take my word for it. You might be able to try it. Maybe go to Squid Games or something and go back and forth between the original Korean, I guess, and then the English dubbed, and see if you can hear a difference in the space. In those, I should mention, in those foreign language channels, they will have a lot of the same sound effects. The sound effects are pretty much consistent. But I think even in, moderately budgeted TV shows and movies, when they bring in the foreign language versions, they don't spend a lot of time trying to recreate the space. They do some of it, but you can hear a difference, not only in the language, which is the most conspicuous difference, but also in how the space sounds. Okay. All right, let's continue. Oh yeah, now what I want to do is actually move a little bit to the research. Some of this research, it's just a coincidence. The whole course isn't about me and my research, but this first example is something we did do in our lab. So it was an experiment we did years ago on asking people if they could recognize rooms based on the sound reflections in those rooms. Okay. So here's the question. Let me get it in here first. Can we recognize rooms based on how those rooms structure sounds? Okay. So we made recordings in different rooms. We made recordings in a bathroom, a classroom. This is actually a classroom in Olmsted. Maybe you've been in there. This is a gym on campus that maybe you've never been in. This is the old basketball courts. Where is it near? It's pretty near the Commons. Oh, it's near where, where the clubs have their offices. It's the building right behind there. And I think it's still a gym. I haven't been there in a long, long time, but this is the gymnasium. And then we did one other recording just in a small laboratory room, also in Olmsted, in the basement of Olmsted. It's a laboratory room next to mine. Very small, kind of like, I don't know, walk-in closet sort of, and maybe a little bit bigger than a walk-in closet sort of room. That gives you a sense. Okay. So we had 4 different rooms that we made these recordings in. Now, importantly, the sounds that were emitted in these rooms always had to, be the same from one room to another. So in all of these rooms, we had a little loudspeaker that was put 6 feet away from where the microphones were. Okay, you're seeing that little loudspeaker there. But all these rooms also had that loudspeaker position when we made these recordings. You're just seeing it in this one case in the gymnasium. So imagine all these had that same loudspeaker. And then because we really didn't know which sounds would be best, we actually played a number of different sounds through them. We played a voice. We played some white noise sounds that sound like like that. White noise is just that shing sound. So, kind of like that thing you did last class with the shh sort of thing. And a number of other types of sounds too. And we just made recordings of all of those same sounds in those 4 different rooms. The only other thing I wanted to add here is we made these recordings in a way that captures the spatial aspects of sound quite well. And that is something you might have learned about yesterday. I told Joanne if she wanted to, she could talk about that. Those were binaural recordings. And the binaural recordings, you may know from yesterday. If not, I'll just tell you very quickly, are made by putting little microphones in the ears of a person, or sometimes like a mannequin head is used and you put it in the ears of the mannequin head. I see there's a little question here, so let me go to that. Oh, okay. Jacqueline says, I always have to switch to the Spanish when watching movies so my parents will understand, but I don't like it because the sound is so off. Yeah, yeah. And it's off, I think, Jacqueline, in a way that it's clearly, you know, the lips are moving differently than what you're hearing. But I think it's also off in this other way that we're talking about now, where the space doesn't seem right. Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. Cool. Okay, binaural recordings though, hopefully she mentioned this yesterday, but if she didn't, that's okay. I'll find out and I'll put a nice demonstration of binaural recordings up if she hasn't. We have some of these in our lab. They're pretty inexpensive. You just put little tiny microphones inside people's ears gently. This is how we did our recordings, and had the person stand 6 feet away from where that loudspeaker is. So essentially here you're seeing you know, the view of that loudspeaker from the position of the person with the microphone. And then we make the recordings of these sounds coming out of the speaker, bouncing around the rooms with all the room's different dimensions, and coming to the microphones in the ears. Okay. Now, I have recordings of these. And I'm wondering if I should, yeah, let me just stop really quickly. I keep on forgetting when we share screen. Oh, hold on a second. How are we doing here? Okay, you know what I'm gonna do? Since I took a little, yeah, all right, let's wait a second since I already stopped this and do a polling question. That's a fun thing to do. All right. Polling question time, everybody. All right. So again, just a little reminder for this. These don't count at all. You're doing this completely anonymously. It doesn't go in your grade. Don't worry about it. It's just a way for me to kind of, well, two things. It's a way for me to see if you're following things okay, and it's a way for you to get a free test question and get the answer to that free test question. This one's also an echolocation. Okay. So I will go, well, let me read it first, then I'll launch it. And I will remind you to take a screenshot of it in just a second. Echolocation can be performed using A, mouth clicks, B, sounds played through a speaker, C, the quiet ambient sounds in a room, or D, all of the above. Okay, go ahead and take a minute to do this, then we'll talk about the answer. All right. Another 15 seconds. Doesn't matter if you get it wrong or right. Just matters that we know the correct answer and we know why it's the correct answer. Okay, terrific. So most of you got this right. The correct answer is D, all of the above, which I believe was the correct answer of the previous question. Okay. As I mentioned, you can use all of these different sounds to echolocate, right? You can use mouth clicks, which is how Daniel Kish does it and how we asked our subjects to do it in our experiment. But we also talked about some of those early experiments using sounds played through a loudspeaker, and people could still perform the task of walking up to the wall and not hitting it. And then we also talked about some experiments where people were just asked, children in this case, were asked to do some echolocating to judge some things about these sound reflecting surfaces. just based on the quiet ambient sounds in the room. So nobody was really making a very conspicuous emitted sound at all. It was just the kind of the ventilation sounds in the room, maybe people's clothes rustling as they're moving. It can be done that way as well. So the correct answer there is D, all of the above, and you might want to take a screenshot since for some reason Zoom doesn't record these. Okay, great. We'll do some more after the break. We'll do some more of these questions. Anyway, let's go back and listen to some of these sounds and see if you're able to tell which is which. So I will share. I keep on doing this, forgetting to do this. Okay, here we go. Now, if you're wearing headphones or earbuds or AirPods or whatever they're called, this will probably work a little better for you. But I'm going to play you 4 different sounds, and I want you just to keep a mental note of which room you think these sounds are recorded in. Now, the emitted sound is always going to be the same. It's going to be, these kind of sound burst white noise sounds. It's going to sound like this. And it turns out that that's a nice type of sound to allow the room to, kind of shape so you can hear the type of room you're in. As you'll see, that's what the results show. But you'll hear that same sound, the ch-ch-ch-ch, in 4 different rooms, and see if you can figure out which room each of these sets of bursts were recorded in. Here's the first one. Here we go. Okay, there's the first one. Let me play it one more time. If you're listening with headphones, it's going to be easier, I'll tell you that much. But I can hear it on my computer pretty well. I could probably determine that from my computer speakers. Here's another one. I'll play that one again. Okay. Another one. It's tough. And then the final one. That one I could do. I haven't listened to these in a while. I think they're very different, especially if they sound different over these kind of stinky little MacBook loudspeakers. But boy, if you're listening over headphones, you probably can hear some real differences here. I hope you can at least. Let me play the first one again, and we'll see if you were right on this. Here's the first one. Now, if you're listening through headphones, you might get this right because it's very clear to me, at least, that first one is recorded in the bathroom. Okay, so hopefully you got that right, or thought maybe it was either the bathroom or the gym. It's okay. Let me play now the second one. Okay, and that one actually was recorded in the classroom. The third one now, if you have headphones, you're going to be able to tell this. People people did wear headphones during this experiment, by the way. When subjects came in, we put headphones on them. And that really is by far the best way to listen to these binaural recordings. If you're wearing headphones, you know that there is this echo in that sound that is got to be a big space. I can kind of hear it on these MacBook loudspeakers, but if you're wearing headphones, you'll definitely hear it. And then finally, clearly, this last one is from the little room. Here, oopsie. All right. See, to me, that sounds like a small space. You know what I'm saying? Even on my little speakers here, it sounds like a small space. Oh, I forgot there's one more. Oops. Which room is that? I'll tell you. All right. That was just to be funny. All right. Hopefully you were able to do some of those because people were outstanding at this when we asked them to do it. So don't worry about the details of this graph at all, but this is percentage correct. And the sound I just played you was this sound right here. So just look at these 4 bars right here. And based on the task we gave them, if they were just guessing, guessing 1 out of 4 is 25, that would be 25% correct if they were just guessing, if they had no idea. But if you look at this, when presented these different rooms, and they saw these pictures, by the way, of the different rooms, about 80 to 90% of the time they were correct in judging which room the sounds were recorded in. It was a very, very simple task for them. In fact, we just realized after we started bringing subjects in, we didn't know how people would do with this because no one had ever been asked to recognize rooms based on how they reflect sound. We didn't know. It seemed obvious to us, but when we brought subjects in, they were so good, we realized that we had to make the task harder. But the first thing we learned is that people are outstanding at doing this sort of thing. By the way, the other sets of bars here are just how they did with different sounds. So we had a recording of a cowbell. We had a human voice that people were really good with as well. We had other types of noise bursts and stuff. But probably with the recording of the human voice and those sounds that you just heard, people are nearly perfect. And it's one of those tasks, one of those crazy tasks that we bring subjects in and tell them what we want them to do, and they don't think they're going to be able to do it. It's like, how am I going to be able to tell which room it's in unless I hear something specific to that room, right? Like I hear a toilet flushing or I hear basketballs or something like that. I don't know if I'm hearing the same sound being created in all these different rooms. I'm not going to be able to do it, and they can do it right away, which is just wonderful for us. So they did it so well, we decided to make it much, much harder. And what we did is we actually cut off most of the sound. So we just played the little kind of echo piece at the very end of the last burst. So all you would hear is something like that. And we told them we were doing that. We said, this was a whole new group of subjects. We said, you're only going to hear a tiny little noise. It's just a single little burst. The question is, was this burst recorded in the bathroom, in the classroom, in the gymnasium, or in the little lab room? And people could do that too. I mean, they weren't as good, but they were always better than chance, and they were getting like 50 to 60% correct. So as it turns out, not only is your brain really, really sensitive to this sort of thing, it needs very little information in order to make correct judgments about this sort of thing. So, I told Sandy and Jay about this, and they said they're not surprised at all. It's just people usually aren't asked to make kind of conscious, explicit judgments of these sort of things, but based on what they know of how important replicating, simulating, and capturing room acoustics is, that they're not surprised that this is the case at all, which is very cool. Okay, let me take our little break here. It will be another 10-minute break. I might need a few more minutes because I want to get some other polling questions up for you. I forgot to do that early this morning. And that way we'll have chances for breaks, and then you'll have more questions ready to go for your exam. Okay, so I'll see you in 10, 12 minutes. Okay, hopefully everything's good. Let's see here. Yeah, cool. All right. I added some polling questions, so we'll do some of those in just a second. But I think we can continue with our discussion. Is everything going okay? Let's see. Yeah, good. All right. So we finished up our discussion of being sensitive to the acoustics of different spaces, different rooms, and talked about how that is present both in the examples discussed by the sound engineers, the sound mixers, the sound designers in Hollywood, as well as research. So now we're going to continue this discussion and move on to a different aspect of this. Before I do, though, are there any questions? Everyone okay? All right. Then I will share my screen again. Let's see here. Cool. Good. Good. Okay. So we're going to move from hearing rooms to actually hearing our positions in rooms. And we're going to start this discussion. Oops. We're going to start this discussion with another set of anecdotes from the film industry, going back to our friend Jay Patterson, who actually brought this up to me. And I thought it was fascinating, especially since it looks like there is some evidence. We were able to show some evidence for this fact in the laboratory as well. Okay. So, this example is discussed in the book, and I still like using that example because I think it makes it very intuitive. But here's the deal. There is a very specific type of microphone that is used still for recording voice. Okay, so we talked a little bit about all the different microphones Jay Patterson typically uses. He has microphones all over the set to capture the reflected sound and how that acoustic signature of the room can be captured. He also uses microphones like this. Can I see this? Yeah. Which are, what are we doing here? Hold on a second. Let me correct this is a tiny bit. Yeah. Okay, good. You can see this, right? This is called a lapel mic, and this is, lecturers use this, teachers use this. We use this a lot in Zoom. And what they have is very small ones that they can attach somewhere inconspicuously to the actors. And that does a great job of capturing the sounds of their speech. But it's interesting. They use a microphone that has been used for a very, very long time because they think the way it works, it allows a more natural way to record the speech of people during dialogue. Okay, and that way is called, well, the problem that actually this causes, first let me discuss, is something called ambient shift. All right, I will define ambient shift in a second, but let me first talk about the microphone. That actually is a scene from, that's a little photo from a scene from Without a Trace. That was the show that Jay Patterson was working on when we did the interview. And the type of microphone I've been referring to is something called a shotgun microphone. And I think if you were to go watch like a filming of a sitcom or something with a live audience, or if you had a chance to watch somebody making a movie or something like that, you would see this microphone still being used. Typically, it's the type of microphone that's on a large kind of boom, meaning a large pole that has the microphone hanging down at the end of it. And at the other end, there's somebody actually working the boom. They're actually working the pivot of the boom. So when one person has a line, it's pointing, the shotgun microphone is pointing at that person. And then when the other person has a line, it swings back. So the microphone kind of continually swings back and forth like this. First, this character would have, or she would have a line. And then when it was his turn to have a line, this microphone would swing back and forth. Okay, that's terrific. It works really well, as it turns out, and it is something I'm not sure I quite understood, but he said that it was a more natural way to record in addition to having lapel mics, in addition to having all the mics all over the place. Okay, so they still use this. But here's the problem with this microphone. The way it's designed is yes, it's directional, meaning it will capture the actor who's speaking at that time, but it would also capture the acoustics behind the actor, okay? And just behind the actor. It's not going to, because of the way the mic's designed, it's not going to record things on the other side. Okay, it won't record things behind the microphone. It really won't record things even, kind of to the back of the microphone. It's just going to record where it's pointing, and then it will record whatever sounds behind. All right, so here's the deal. And let's now move to the book example, because I think it makes it much more intuitive. It is the case that any room will have a different set of reflectances in different spaces. So yes, we can say that a room has an overall acoustic signature, but it also has different kind of subtle acoustic differences in different locations. So you look at the room you're in right now. As I look at, I use my garage not for garage, but for a rehearsal space. And I have a carpet here in one side of the room. I have a couch over here, another side of the room, a soft couch on the other side of the room. And then the other side of the room, though, is pretty much all hard surfaces. You can't see this right now. I don't want to bother taking the picture down, but I imagine if you look around the room you're in right now too, you would see that there are kind of soft surfaces in some places and hard surfaces in other places. Right, the bedroom example I give in the book is really nice. Imagine you're having you're Brad Pitt and you're having a dialogue with Jennifer Aniston. Right, I think those are the characters, the actors I have in that example. And she's sitting on the bed, and you're kind of standing as Brad Pitt, kind of in front of a wall that has like glass, or pictures or something like that. Not only that, but behind the bed where Jennifer Aniston is sitting is a kind of tapestry, a kind of a soft textured kind of wall hanging, right? Now you can imagine that there are different acoustic properties in different spaces, right? So when Jennifer is speaking, okay, her voice leaves her mouth and goes all over. But the part that she has in back of her is a much kind of more dampened acoustic place than me as Brad Pitt, where I'm speaking from a location that has hard surfaces behind me. Okay, so it's kind of, I think, intuitive as to understand that different parts of a room have different acoustic kind of properties. Here's the problem now with that shotgun microphone. If Jennifer and I have our scene together and we're sharing dialogue going back and forth, that shotgun mic, here, let me use this. That shotgun mic, when it's pointing to Jennifer, okay, is not only going to capture Jennifer's dialogue nicely, it's going to capture the sound structure that's behind her, which is going to be a little bit more dampened than the sound structure behind me as Brad Pitt, because there are hard, reflective surfaces behind me. So as the microphone goes back and forth, it has the potential to make it seem like the scene is actually recorded in two different spaces, right? So when it's pointing at Jennifer, it can make it sound kind of like it's in a quiet bedroom or walk-in closet or something like that. But when it's pointing to me and I got these hard surfaces behind me and it's capturing what's behind me, it could make it sound like maybe I'm in a bathroom or a locker room or something like that. And if you just listen to the recordings of a shotgun microphone, just in a normal room like this, that's what happens. Okay. So what Jay Patterson needs to do is compensate for that as well as he's setting up blankets. Okay. So what he's saying is not just that every room has a sound signature. He's saying every room is differentially reflective, is structuring acoustics differently in different parts of the room. Okay, so it gets even more kind of tricky than what we were talking about. And because of the shotgun microphone recording in such a narrow area, which is being depicted down here, the shotgun is facing here. It's not just getting the shotgun's facing this way. It's not just recording where that person's position is, but it's recording everything behind that person. What happens is when that mic shifts back and forth, it can cause the actor to sound if they're in separate rooms, as if they're in separate rooms, in different rooms with different acoustic characteristics. Okay. This is ambient shift. This is what he means by ambient shift. That when the microphone shifts back and forth, it can sound like the actors are in different ambient acoustic spaces. And you don't want that, right? You want them to sound like they're in the exact same space. It's kind of a thing he has to do to compensate from the shifting back and forth of the microphone. So he solves it the same way. He basically not only has to make the space sound like it looks, he has to make the space sound pretty much the same in different areas when it comes to using that microphone. Okay, so modifications are made to equalize the acoustics to at least some degree behind the actors. Okay. So, he wants to capture the acoustic signature, but at the same time doesn't want to get it so exact that it's going to have to sound like these people are in different spaces as this kind of weird microphone is capturing it back and forth. Now you might be wondering, when you listen to dialogue in a room, when you listen to two people talk in a bedroom, if you're there with your friends, or you're at a coffee shop and you're listening to people talk at the table next to you, it doesn't really sound like they're talking in different spaces, even if the acoustic space behind them is different. And it's because your ears don't act like this shotgun microphone, right? Your ears are taking in all of the information from all the locations. But the shotgun microphone has this problem where it does so. But that's okay, because I think what this really demonstrates is that our brains are not just sensitive to how a room should sound based on how it looks. It is sensitive to how different locations in the room should sound based on what we're seeing. Okay. So the brain should be sensitive to, when we are in fact in a different position in a room. Okay, that's where we're going. We are sensitive to the sound of different room positions. It's kind of a nice anecdote to get us into this. And we did some research on this too. Again, it's not going to be like this the rest of the quarter, I promise. This is the first chapter. It does include some research out of my lab. We did research on asking people to try to judge where in a room they are based on how that area of the room structures reflected sound. Okay, so that's the important component here. Just to kind of give you an overall idea of what the experiment is like, we put people on carts like this and move them to different positions in a room. It was a classroom. In fact, I think it was the actual classroom that you just saw the photo of from Olmsted. Just happened to be one that was handy at the time. And we cleared everything out, all the chairs and everything, and moved these blindfolded folks from one position to another and asked them where they thought they were in the room. Okay. We moved them to one of 9 spaces. You don't need to know these, kind of minute details, but we moved them either to the front left of the room, or the front middle, or the front right, or the middle right, center, middle left, one of these 9 different spaces. So they actually knew that. We told them that they had to make a judgment of where they were out of 9 different positions. And then here's the other thing. They needed to make these judgments not based on, say, listening to something emanating in the room, like, oh, I'm now to the left of the ventilation system, so I must be on the right side of the room. Now I'm on the left side of the room because I can hear the ventilation coming right. We did not want them to be able to do it that way. So we made sure that the ventilation in the room was turned off, of course. But we also wanted the dominant sound to be a sound that followed them around, which is exactly what you're seeing here. You're seeing a second here. Let me get this good. Yeah. You're seeing a little loudspeaker that's placed on this cart that follows them around. So we put them in the position that we want them to guess. And then we have a sound come out of here, because that sound is then going to be structured differently, whether they're in a corner or in the middle of the room or just against a flat wall like this. Okay, so let's kind of get some of this in our notes. This is based on room reflections, not the sound sources. So we had to have the sound source move with the listener. Okay. And then we had a number of different sounds we used. We actually allowed the subjects to try to use their voice and go testing like that. We used, which is kind of like an echolocation sort of task in a way. We had them use a clicker, and then we had noise bursts from this loudspeaker and they were very similar to the noise bursts that you just heard in the previous experiment. And I wanted you to kind of put yourself in imagining being in this experiment. A couple of other things we did that I haven't mentioned yet. First of all, we had to disorient them all the time, because we don't want them to, have a sense of how they've moved from one part of the room to another part of the room just based on how they feel themselves moving. So we did that spinning thing you saw them do with the echolocation subjects back in the 1940s, right? We do that. We also make sure that they can't hear their changing positions. So we put headphones on them and play music to them as we're changing them from one position to another. Then we have them take their headphones off, okay, and listen for sounds and try to determine whether they're in a corner, whether in their center, whether in the front, whether in the back, whatever, okay. And what we found is, in fact, that listeners are not bad at it. They're certainly not as good as they were in the previous experiment at judging which room they're in, but they're at better than chance levels, which in this case would be 1 out of 9, determining where they are. Now, you might be able to have an intuition about this. You can imagine that if you're in a room and you say are going testing 1 2 testing 1 2, what you hear if you're in the middle of the room as you say that would be different than what you would hear if you were in, say, a back corner or a front wall or a back wall or something like that. You might have an intuition that you would have a different sound experience in this case. However, it's just amazing that people could actually, be consistent enough to be better than chance, even though they've never done this before and they had really no general strategy to try to, improve this or anything. The brain just seems sensitive, not only to the kind of acoustic signature of a room, but the acoustic signature to different positions in the room. Okay? That's the kind of point of this. All right, so we can hear room position based on this type of thing, based on these sort of experiments. Okay, let's go on with another lesson from Hollywood. And we're going to go back to our friend, what's his name? Sandy Berman. And go to the other thing he does in his studio besides the looping, and that is Foley. We talked a little bit about Foley. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to do it. Foley recording. Okay, so Foley recording is the sound effects that are typically done, not for like things like, spaceship explosions. That's something that's done certainly on computer, but we're talking about, kind of the everyday things. Like here's footsteps. You can see in this image that people in the studio are walking, and they usually walk on a particular type of surface. And they do that as they're watching the video, as they're watching the film, so they can synchronize their footsteps with what's being seen. So typically when you do recordings out in the field, when you do recordings on location, it's hard to get the footsteps to sound clear. So footsteps are added later, most usually. And it turns out footsteps are a really kind of interesting sound when it comes to video and film. They need to be really good at this. If things aren't very well synchronized, if the surface that they're walking on in the studio isn't similar acoustically to the surface they're walking on in the movie or in the film scene, people are very aware of it. Is the sort of thing, well, aware in the sense that it will throw them out of the being engaged. They might not know why they're distracted, but it could very well be that the footsteps weren't recorded well in the studio. Right there, you can see, I think, the scene that they're watching there, that the sound technicians are watching, is a scene where two people are walking out in a park and they're walking over leaves. What you're seeing the technicians do, I believe they're walking on leaves that they've brought into the studio and put on the ground. So when you see the characters walking on leaves, you're hearing people walking on leaves. So again, footsteps seem to be an especially conspicuous thing in the sense that if they aren't created well in the studio, if they're not redubbed well in the studio, it can disengage the audience and make them distracted, kind of lose being in the scene. Okay, so it's to the point with footsteps, by the way, that, as Sandy has told me, that when you see footsteps going behind an object, that sound needs to change, right? And this is how sound works, right? So if I put something over my mouth, well, it's not going to work too well because the microphone's underneath. But if I do this sort of thing, you know that the sound has to change. If you see something going over a mouth, the sound has to change. It's the same with footsteps. If you see somebody walking behind an object, okay, the sound needs to change. It's like, I think in the book I talk about closing a door, the sound has to change, right? That's a kind of more conscious awareness example. But say in this scene that we've been talking about, where the actors are walking in a park, if all of a sudden they go behind a concrete picnic table or something like that, or even maybe a large tree, what the audience has to hear is a change in the nature of those footsteps, because the camera is at a perspective that would involve the characters going behind something relative to the camera's position. So Sandy will say, whenever that happens in a film, he has to change the nature of the footsteps a little bit. They get quieter, probably. They sound more muffled, I suppose, when a footstep goes behind an object. Okay. I asked him how he does that. He said, well, we can do things electronically. We can, kind of make it a little bit quieter, turn down the footstep recording a little bit. Maybe, I don't know if you know how, your stereo works, that you can turn down the treble of your stereo and makes it sound a little bit more muffled. They can do that type of thing too. But he said, what they really like to do is to actually bring out some sort of baffle, some sort of board, maybe an object or something like that, that would then be used during the recording of the actual footsteps in the studio. Okay, so microphones in this case are going to be placed behind baffles, on the other side of the baffles, as these footsteps are being recorded, right? If they're being recorded based on a person standing in one position, what they might have to do is actually slowly roll the baffle in. So all of a sudden, from the microphone's position, it's going to capture footsteps that are now a tiny bit more muffled. But what Sandy will say is that baffle, that muffling, has to be very precise. In other words, if they're walking behind a tree, that baffle needs to be about, the width of a tree, and then has to, kind of move on. If they're going behind a concrete picnic table or something like that, that baffle has to be the size of the picnic table, or it just doesn't work. He thinks that there's enough of a mismatch between the sound and what's seen that it will throw people out of the scene. So even though it sounds minor, the baffle shape that's going to change the sound of the footsteps has to be very close to what's seen in the film. The baffle shape matters. Again, baffle is just, some sort of board, something like that, that's going to be used to change the sound of the footsteps. Cool. Well, I told him when he told me this, he said, yeah, you wouldn't think this would matter. And I said, I got good news for you, Sandy, because in our lab, got another experiment in our lab, our experiments have shown that this is absolutely the case. And I call this the hearing silent shapes experiment, but it's not important, that kind of cutesy title. But let me tell you what these experiments involved. The first set of experiments we did, we asked people to come into the laboratory and actually showed them everything that was going on. All right, they weren't blindfolded before they came in. We had big kind of sound deadening pieces of insulation. It was a type of, the type of thing you put in a wall to keep the temperature stable. But it also does a nice job of sound insulation as well. So let's just ignore this up here for now. Let's just talk about these two boards, because that's what we started with. And we said, okay, these boards are going to move back and forth. Okay, and you're going to stand kind of just in front of the board. So here are the boards, and I'm going to stand here. And you're going to be blindfolded, but we're going to have you listen carefully to sounds that are coming from the other sides of the boards. And that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing a set of, oops, what's going on here? Hold on. There we go. You're seeing little loudspeakers that are on the other side of the boards. Okay, and those loudspeakers were just playing. I think what we did is we used sounds recorded from the cafeteria. Yeah, the cafeteria on campus. We just wanted kind of a very kind of somewhat familiar, but kind of rich sound. And those were the sounds that were coming from, I think we had 9 loudspeakers on the other side. Okay. And what we told people they're going to be doing is not making judgments on those sounds per se, but making judgments on where the things that are kind of obstructing the sounds are located. So we said we're going to move these boards back and forth, and we're going to ask you something about the position of those boards relative to the sound. So we're basically asking them about the position, the precise position of those baffles just from listening. Okay, so here's a little bit more information. So we're talking about sound occluding surfaces. That's what these boards are doing. They're occluding sounds. And they're occluding sounds in ways that we can manipulate. We can change the position of the boards. And these boards are just very simply positioned in front of a set of loudspeakers. And the initial task for subjects is to be blindfolded, listen to those sounds coming from beyond where those boards are, and then tell us, as you're listening to the location of where the sound is occluded, are the boards in positions that would be wide enough for you to walk through if you were asked to, or are they too close together for you to be asked to walk through? Okay. And it's kind of a weird task, but we thought that we would make it as intuitive as possible when it comes to trying to determine the location of these boards. So these big boards are here. Sometimes they're too close for me to walk through. Sometimes they're certainly wide enough. I would have no problem walking through them. Sometimes they're going to be, I don't know. I'm not quite sure if they're close enough to walk through. Sometimes it's going to be hard, potentially. Okay. All right, so that's the first task. So we did another task too, where we asked people if they could fit under the board without having to duck. But let's talk primarily about this task here. And here's what we found. We found that when people were asked to listen to the position of the sound occluding boards and whether they could walk between the boards, whether they could walk through the space made by the boards, they were really, really good at this, astonishingly good. In fact, they were almost as good, get this, at making that judgment as if they were actually not blindfolded and just looking at the boards and not listening to any sound at all. And then were asked whether they could walk through that, which just kind of freaked us out. I mean, how people never, none of our subjects were ever asked to do this. None of them thought that they would be able to do this, right? It's one of these kind of hidden skills they didn't know their brains could use. But when it came to judging whether the boards were just at the right distance from each other to walk through, they were nearly as good as if they were actually seeing it. And we're not talking about the position of things making sound. We're talking about the position of things that are blocking sound, the precise position of things that are blocking sounds. The same thing is also true of when we asked them, we took away those two big blackboards here and just used this kind of gray board here and asked them whether that board was in a position where they could walk under it, okay, based on how it was blocking the sound, or was it too low for them to be able to walk under it without ducking? Same type of thing, okay? Cool. We were really, really amazed at how good people were at this. So we decided to push our luck a little bit and do another set of experiments. This set of experiments asked even more difficult judgments from subjects. This experiment involved asking whether they could determine the shape of a board that covered up sound. It's kind of going back to the Sandy Berman sort of thing, right? Where he said he thinks the shape of the baffle matters. If that's true, Sandy, then people should be able to some degree perceive the shape of a baffle. They should be able to determine the shape of something that's occluding sound, that's a covering up sound. And yeah, that's what we did. We put a triangle in front of loudspeakers, or a disc, a circle, basically a solid circle in front of loudspeakers, or a square, and asked people if they could judge which of those three shapes was placed in front of those loudspeakers. As you can see here, our array of loudspeakers is a little different from it was in the previous experiments. I think we had more. But they were still emitting these recordings of the cafeteria sounds, kind of people just milling about, very kind of common, ambient sound in the sense that it's in the background, right? We wanted it to be familiar. But as they were listening to these sounds, they were also listening to see if they could determine which object it was. And what we found is, regardless of the subjects, all of them could do it better than chance. Well, they're not perfect at it, right? They're not perfect at it by any means, but chance performance would be 30%. They were like 50, 60% easily. And they were amazed they could do it at all. So they'd be blindfolded, just to kind of bring this home for you, that we have some headphones on them so they couldn't hear us putting a shape up, but then we take the headphones off, they'd stay blindfolded, we'd have the sounds coming up from behind the board, and they say, okay, we know you can hear those sounds, but can you tell the shape of the thing that's in front of the sounds? The shape's not making any sound at all. That's the hearing silent shape thing, but they can do it. They can determine that it's the triangle, it is the disc, it is the square, which, we're really amazed that they could do it at all. But in addition to that, we had some listeners who were correct about 85, 90% of the time. About 4 of the 25 subjects we ran in this experiment, 4 or 5, I think, were able to do it with 90% accuracy, 85, 90% accuracy, which is amazing. And they would do it quickly too. We'd put up the triangle, we take off their headphones, and where a lot of subjects would go, I think maybe it's the triangle. We take off these folks' headphones, these 5 subjects' headphones, and they say, oh, triangle. Okay, put the headphones back on. Square. They seem to do it really quickly. And, we wondered maybe they're seeing something. And the blindfold we put on them is pretty intense. I mean, we make sure that they really can't see, but we had no idea why they were doing this. So we went back and we interviewed the people that were really good. And they all had something in common. They all had done some sound design or sound engineering or sound mixing, even just a little bit. Like, maybe some of you have friends that have hobbies as DJs, right? And what they do is when they come into a location where they're DJing, they set up the speakers in the best positions in the room so the sound is best. And then they, kind of change the balance of the speakers and all that sort of thing. That was at least half of the 5, 2 out of the 3 or 3 of the subjects that were so good at this were DJs and had experience kind of balancing sound. The other 2 or 3 did sound engineering for their churches. where a lot of churches these days have musicians performing, and they would be the ones that were responsible for making sure that the music sounded balanced and good in the space they were in. And with just that experience, they're not professional by any means. It's kind of a little thing they do on Sundays to help out their church, something they do maybe once a month to DJ or something like that. That was enough experience with kind of sound subtleties to allow them to perform this task really well, which is interesting. It suggests that first, yeah, the brain, it can be sensitive to these subtleties of things that don't make sound but shape sound, right? And it can get better. The brain can get better at this, even with the sort of experience that isn't directly related to being able to hear baffles or something like that. Just to kind of fine tuning your listening for purposes of your hobby or your profession seems to help this a lot, which is amazing. Okay, we're going to continue to talk about. Actually, this is a nice place to do a little polling question before we just finish this topic up. So let's do that. I will stop my sharing and we will do our next polling question. And this one has to do with Sandy Berman. Okay. Which of the following are techniques to make redub dialogue, loop dialogue, redub dialogue sound as if it's recorded in the same room as the original scene? So these are Sandy Berman's techniques. A, room tone recordings. B, it should just say worldizing. It's going to say choice worldizing because I forgot to remove the word choice when I plugged in that answer, worldizing. C, physically recreating the original room's acoustic space. Or D, all of the above. Again, the second choice shouldn't have the word choice there. I forgot to remove it when I was adding that answer. It should just be the answer worldizing as choice B. Oh boy, look at you go. You're doing a good job here. Give you another 20 seconds or so. Okay, I think that's fine. Again, you're not being graded on this. Just good to know the answer and to get used to the questions and get a free question. The correct answer is D. In fact, once again, it is all of the above. You're going to go to the test and think that that's always the answer, and you'll see it's not. But these last three questions were all the above as the correct answer. Sandy Berman taught us that the room tone recording does work. The worldizing technique is another technique that's used, and that's the one where he actually flew down to Mexico City again after they had finished the original filming, and he re-recorded J-Lo's recorded voice in that space. And then finally, the thing he likes best is physically recreating the original room's acoustic space. Just so we're clear on this, this question didn't say which is the best, it said which of the following techniques are used as if it's been recorded in the same room. So yeah, they all have been used, and really for Sandy it depends on the budget of the film, the budget of the TV show. He will use all those. He prefers certainly to use the last one, but the correct answer is all of the above for this. Okay, go ahead and take a picture if you haven't, and we will stop here and go back. Any questions on this? We'll do one more polling question at the very end of class today. Okay. Cool. So I'm glad we had a chance to talk about these kind of expert listeners in this context of the hearing silent shapes demonstration, because I'm going to talk a little bit about your expertise with listening, because it's interesting. Um, you are better listeners than my generation are. That's the kind of the big take home here. Especially when comes to these types of characteristics we've been talking about. And a lot of this has to do with just the fact that technologies have changed, but there's other aspects to this as well. And I wanted to talk a little bit first, though, about some evidence, some early evidence that people are truly sensitive to this, at least anecdotal evidence from the folks I talked to. And as you'll see in the book, one of the folks I talked to was a gentleman named Zoli Asaze, who for his job was both the sound mixer and sound designer. Now, he worked on a soap opera. I think we know what soap operas are. Yeah. Kind of telenovelas, but kind of the American version. Very inexpensively made. Made usually each episode is made fairly quickly. So they don't have a separate sound designer and a sound mixer. He does both. The show he worked on was called Days of Our Lives, and at the time it was the oldest running soap opera. It had been running for 50 years. I don't know if it's still on. I'm embarrassed to say. Maybe you know, or your grandmas know, or something like that. I'm not sure. But it was popular enough, and people used to watch these regularly. Certainly, my grandma did. She was a big fan of soap operas. She called them her stories. And all afternoon, that's what she would do. When she was late retirement. And he told me this really interesting anecdote I think you'll enjoy. He told me a situation where they had gotten some new equipment on the set, and really what it was a set of remote control cameras. So, in the old days, what they would do, these shows usually, I should mention, are filmed quickly, and they're filmed with multiple cameras, and kind of the old style video cameras where there'd be somebody behind it. So on the set there would be, say 2 or 3 large cameras, and there'd be a person behind each camera, kind of directing where it was looking, that sort of thing. But they decided to modernize a little bit, and so what they did is they brought in some remote control cameras that were on kind of pulleys and rods that would allow the cameras to kind of move back and forth. And then they had the camera folks in the kind of the control room, kind of moving things with joysticks. Okay, that's fine. I mean, it's probably more consistent in terms of the shots, and it certainly was easier for the camera folks. But what he said was, when they installed that new system, they had to change the position of the baffles and blankets and things like that on the set. Okay, so for these soap operas, they typically have a set in one part of the studio that is one character's apartment, and then a set on just a few yards away, that's another apartment, and so they're all over the place. And when they put these new cameras in this one prominent character's apartment, they had to change the sound. They didn't change anything in the way it looked, right? Everything was left absolutely the same, but they had to change where the blankets were to make room for these new cameras. And by the way, I don't know if I guess Bo was one of the main characters, and it was his apartment they had to do this with. And what happened is, after they started, showing these episodes with the new cameras, they started getting these letters, and it was, snail mail letters from, these people who had been watching the show for 30 years and knew Bo's apartment really, really well, and said, "What did you do to Bo's apartment? It looks different. There's something different about it." And he looked at these letters and said, "We didn't change anything. It looks exactly the same. The cameras were pretty much in the same positions that they always had been in. They could move a little bit more smoothly now, but they were in the same position." And then they realized what had happened was they changed the acoustic structure of Bo's apartment to the point where it seemed like there was something different about it. Like it sounded all of a sudden a little bigger than it used to sound. And these women, mostly, who watch these shows, wrote in to say they didn't like it. They didn't like the way they had changed Beau's apartment without usually knowing it had anything to do with the sound. So they had to go back in and replace the baffles and blankets at least close to where they were before they had moved them for the new cameras, because the people were kind of just a little startled by whatever the change was, even if they didn't know what the change was. Okay, but let me go on and talk about, so that kind of shows that people are probably sensitive to some of these things, even if they're not sure, what's changed. But I now want to talk about a kind of interesting situation that has to do with designing spaces for music. And this is going to be based on an interview I did, one of my favorite interviews I did with a gentleman named Yasuhisa Toyoda. But the upshot of this is that he believes, as do folks that do music engineering, and it was something that Sandy and Jay said as well, that we have become more discriminating when it comes to these dimensions of sound over time. So yes, I think probably your generation is a little bit more aware of discrepancies than mine, mostly having to do with technology. You're hearing, even if you're listening to MP3, moderately sampled rate music, there's a clarity in what you're hearing that was certainly not there when I was growing up. I listened to cassettes. I listened to vinyl, but the vinyl that I listened to was not created nearly as well as the vinyl. If you folks have, if you're vinyl fans, or you have family members or friends that are vinyl fans, that the fidelity is much higher than what I listened to. And movie sound wasn't nearly as good. There were maybe 2 loudspeakers in the theaters I grew up with, rather than the entire, side walls and back walls, and much of the front walls being covered with sets of loudspeakers. It wasn't like that when I was growing up. And, between that and the technologies for actually doing the recording, you folks are more discriminating when it comes to this sort of thing than I was. Okay. So our friend Yasuhisa Toyoda is what's called an architectural acoustician. And architectural acousticians are the folks that design theaters for live performances. So the acoustics are good. He, as it turns out, when I interviewed him, had just started to become one of the, let's say, top 5 most famous architectural acousticians in the world. Just so happened, I wasn't quite aware of this, but he had just finished designing the inside to Disney Hall. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to Disney Hall. We'll talk about its characteristics in just a second, but it is, I believe, considered one of the best acoustically designed halls in the world. And he started taking a very unique approach to designing acoustic spaces. I asked him, why he actually changed from kind of the tradition of acoustic spaces. As you'll see, that the interior of the hall it looks very different from the interior of older spaces, at least. And I asked him why he decided to make these changes, and he said, well, I need to replicate the characteristics that the audience is used to listening to music with. So what does that involve? Well, he feels like he's competing against what was then CD quality and now is, kind of streaming quality sound. And, even if you're streaming at a relatively low rate, it's still going to be better than what I grew up with, right? And it's probably going to come very close to CD quality. And he said that people are listening to such acoustic detail now as they listen to music. And the other thing is, when music is recorded now, especially classical music, it's recorded with many, many microphones placed very, very close to the instruments of the orchestra. Okay, so there's each member of the orchestra has a microphone attached to their instrument. So the first viola, the second viola, the third, all the instruments have microphones attached to them now. That wasn't the case in the old days. In the old days, the microphones were typically positioned maybe there were a handful of microphones, maybe two, maybe four microphones that were positioned kind of over where the audience would sit in a studio. So it was back from the orchestra and kind of hanging down. I should probably get some pictures of these so you can see how it used to be done. And the idea is what, yes, it was in stereo, hopefully at that point, right? And what you'd want is a stereo recording that would capture what it sounds like from the audience's position as they listen to an orchestra. Okay, nice, that worked for a while. But now the recordings are made with microphones right at the instrument. And because of the technology not being kind of scratchy vinyl on crappy phonographs, right? The technology, the CD, the MP3 technology, is going to allow a degree of clarity that never existed before. And he said that people listen to music like this. They listen to music where they have a certain intimacy with each of the instruments because of where the microphones are, and they have this clarity just because of where the technology has taken us. They can hear things so clearly. That's what they expect to hear when they come to live situations. Okay, so it's no longer sufficient to just have an audience kind of sit back from the orchestra and just in a big group and listen to the orchestra that way. He needs to somehow recreate the intimacy and clarity of what people are hearing at home through headphones, through their own stereo system. And that led him to come up with a completely different design called the vineyard design of theaters, of indoor spaces. And as you can see, that's the interior of Disney Hall. As you can see from that space, it kind of does look like a vineyard, right? You've been to, I don't know if you've ever been to vineyards or seen pictures of vineyards where they kind of grow the grapes on a hill, right? So you see the grapevines on different levels of a hill. And that's kind of what this looks like if you can, kind of look closer at it. There's kind of tiers of seats that go very steeply on all sides of where the orchestra is going to be playing, including the back. The seats in back are for cheaper tickets, but you can see here that this would be on all other sides of the orchestra. It is kind of like a vineyard. It goes up very steeply, it's in tiers, and there's one other aspect of it I wanted to point out. And I should make this picture bigger next time. I don't know if you can see this here, but there are actually, the tiers are separated by walls. In this case, it's wooden walls. But so yeah, I should probably get another picture of this to show you. If you look, you can look online, find pictures of Disney Hall. It's world famous. There are walls kind of separating the spaces. Now, what does that do? This kind of interior design. Well, first of all, because you're going up steep like this, your actual distance to each instrument is smaller than if you were sitting kind of in a standard theater where, like a movie theater or something like that, where it was going kind of back slowly, because then you're really far away if you're in back. But now, because you're high, okay, that distance is less than if you were way back here like this, okay? That's one thing. You're closer to the instruments than other designs would allow. The other thing is that these walls that are close by to each section reflect sound in a way that also makes you feel like you're closer to the instrument. Okay? So when the sound leaves the orchestra, it goes, first of all, it goes to you more closely, but then it also hits these walls that are nearby, and that actually reflect into your position, allowing for there to be this kind of intimacy with the sound. But it also, because of the way the walls are designed, allows for this clarity to exist. So this design is especially useful for clarity and intimacy of sound, which is what he wants. And he's doing this again. He's doing this again to kind of simulate what you're experiencing when you're listening to music through headphones, and it's MP3, and it's music that's been recorded with microphones very, very close to the instruments, usually touching the instruments, in fact. Okay, so this is what he's had to do, and it works brilliantly. It works brilliantly. Now, I don't know if you've ever been there, but I've had a chance to go to a few concerts. And oh my gosh, you feel it, it's almost like an illusion. So you know that the instruments are down there, but sometimes it feels like the instruments are next to you. It is astonishing. And there's no loudspeakers that are doing this. It's not like there's little, cheating loudspeakers next to you or behind you or anything like that. It's just the way it's designed, the way the sound comes up and bounces off the walls makes it sound like the instruments are much closer and much clearer than they would be in another context. In fact, there's some really funny anecdotes about this. When the theater first opened, by the way, you know the theater I'm talking about. You can see this is the outside. This is kind of this iconic building that's in downtown LA now, the Disney Theater. That's what it looks like on the outside. And Mr. Toyota did not design the outside. That's what's his name, Frank Gehry, right? But he did design the inside along with Gehry's help acoustically. He's become one of the most sought after architectural acousticians now. In fact, he's worked on hundreds of theaters. When I was interviewing him, he had just started redesigning the interior of the Sydney Opera House, in Australia. So, when you see like pictures of Australia or Sydney, you see that opera house that kind of looks like waves. Really cool building from the outside. But he said inside it was a terribly designed acoustic space. So they were having him redo that with this kind of vineyard seating. Anyway, yeah, the anecdotes when this place first opened, and it was one of the first kind of well-known vineyard designs, and the reviewers talked about how clear and how close everything seemed. They said, some of them, that it's not only that you hear the orchestra sound clear and close, you hear every other person in the theater sound clear and close. So in the winter, when people would come in and they were getting over colds and coughs, even if they were no longer contagious, people would cough every now and then, and you would hear the cough like it was sitting right next to you, and it could be a little distracting. So what they did very soon after the theater opened and they realized this was a little bit of an issue is they used to have cough drops, big bins of cough drops right near the front doors of each section of the theater. And they would say, if you're having a little cough, please take a few cough drops, and if that way you can be quieter. And it helped get rid of the coughs. But the problem was it was so well designed in terms of the clarity and intimacy. You wouldn't hear the coughs, but you'd hear people unwrapping the cough drops. It'd be a little distracting, but it would be probably better than the cough. So, but it was that clear. And again, the point of this is that we've had to kind of change the style of how we design acoustic spaces, because your brains, young people's brains especially, are better at picking out these acoustic details than certainly we all used to be, where it wouldn't really matter that much to folks growing up with just stereo vinyl, where the instruments were recorded from 2 microphones and back. Now they have to rival all these sorts of advantages that the technology and the approach have given to our listening. Okay, that ends our discussion of chapter 1. Here, I do have a summary slide, I believe. Yeah, you already have these things down. These are just the lessons from Hollywood and a little bit of research. So we're exquisitely sensitive to how rooms structure sound. We're sensitive to the sound of different room positions. We're sensitive to when and how sounds are obstructed. And we are getting even more sensitive to these characteristics as time's gone on. And yeah, certainly if we have to be careful as we're listening to music through headphones and earbuds and that sort of stuff, not to play too loud, because we can lose a little of our hearing. But even if we do lose a little of our hearing, our brains are sensitive to these dimensions, even if we can't maybe hear them quite as well as we did before we listened to loud music or whatever. Our brains are still able to pick up these nuances, making it in some ways harder for the job of these architectural acousticians and the sound engineers that are in movies and TV work. Okay. Any questions about this before we go on to the next section on listening? And actually, I guess what I'll do probably would be best now to do our polling question, since I'm stopping anyway. Let's do that. So here's another polling question. This one also has to do with the work of the sound engineers. Okay, so this one is the fact that movie audiences will be distracted if a scene's visible space does not match its audible space suggests what? A, every space has an acoustic signature. B, humans are sensitive to how rooms structure sound. C, the brain has a huge tolerance for mismatched vision and hearing. Or D, both A and B. I'll give you about a minute to do this. Okay, another few seconds here. Great, that should do it. You did well. Let's go ahead and, oops, what happened here? Oh, okay. Hold on a second, there we are. Okay, let me share the results. The correct answer is again, D. It's both A and B, but at least it's not all the above. I think you weren't tricked by question or answer C though, which is nice. So yes, the fact that every room has an acoustic signature is a very important component of the fact that we can kind of be thrown out of our engagement with the scene if there's not a match between what we're seeing and what we're hearing. Okay, and that is just another way of saying humans are sensitive to how rooms structure sound. So the answer B is correct too. C is incorrect. We do not have a huge tolerance. We're very picky when it comes to mismatching vision and hearing when it comes to these scenes. So C is incorrect. So the correct answer for this test question would be D. Both A and B are correct answers. Okay. Take a picture if you haven't yet. And we'll continue. All right. There you go. Cool. Okay, so we're going to go on to our next chapter on hearing. And as I said, when we introduced the topics of the course, we're going to now talk about not hearing sound reflections and how rooms structure sound and how spaces structure sound, but we're going to be talking about things that make sound now, things that emanate sound, the way we usually think about sound. But we're going to be talking about some kind of unique aspects of that. And the first one I want to talk about, go ahead and share. Okay, let me make myself big. Good. It has to do with auditory approach. And good. Now, all auditory approach means is our ability to perceive when something that's making sound is approaching us, or we're approaching something that's making sound. Now, as it turns out, this is something that we're doing all the time, right? So, whether it's nighttime and it's dark in our room and our alarm goes off, and you're reaching out to grab your alarm clock, a phone, or whatever to turn off the alarm, we are judging approach because our arm is judging when it needs to stop and grab something, right? That's all of an example of auditory approach. That case, we're moving towards something, but in other cases, we're dealing with things that are coming towards us that we're perceiving largely through sound, and having to make judgments of whether we need to move away or something. And maybe one of the most intuitive examples that we will be talking about in some detail is trying to say walk around a parking lot or something, and then all of a sudden noticing that there's a car coming from behind us and we need to move to the side. I mean, whenever I walk my dog, For some reason, my dog has gotten into the habit of liking to walk straight in the middle of the street, and I'll pull him to the side because I know it's dangerous. But for some reason, he likes to go there, and he likes to do his business in the middle of the street. And so I've got to pull him away, but he still always tries to pull back to the middle of the street. And so I have to be very careful that there's not cars coming from the direction I'm not looking, right? Usually with the dog, I'm looking whatever direction he's pulling in. And so if there's a car coming from behind me, I need to judge auditory approach. So I know that I need to move to the side, or I have time before I need to move to the side, or the car was coming towards me and now it's stopped and gone into a driveway. I need to be able to do this at least to some degree. Ultimately, I will turn around and be safe and look to make sure it's there, but these are all examples of auditory approach. And you're going to see that ability for us to perceive auditory approach turns out to be something that is really kind of fine-tuned in our brains. And one of the I think the coolest ways to demonstrate that is to talk about this beep baseball that I mentioned when we first were introducing the class. And these are these blind baseball players who will play on teams from their region, and then go to the playoffs and World Series of beef baseball. It's a serious sport. I mean, it's great fun. I mean, the whole family comes out and it's fun to watch and all that sort of thing. But the athletes themselves take it very seriously, and it's really something to watch. It's really, really interesting to watch. So let me tell you just a little bit about the sport. And then we'll see a little video that kind of depicts it nicely. I guess it started in 1964, and it's interesting. I didn't realize that. I knew about it in probably about 1966 because my dad, I might have mentioned here, or maybe not, but it's in the book. My dad was the director of an agency for the blind in upstate New York, and I used to go to his offices when I was a little kid back in the 60s and see all these really kind of cool devices that had been designed to help the blind. And one of my favorite, which I have here somewhere, oh shoot, I can't believe, did I not bring it in? I just thought okay, no one panic. If I don't have it, I'll bring it next class, it's no problem. But somewhere in my house, it was a beep softball. And they had, I said, what is this, Dad? And he said, well, I guess they're starting to have teams where they're playing softball against each other, and they're doing so based on the ball making a beep sound, which you'll hear in just a second. And I thought this was so cool, the fact that they could use the sound of a softball to actually hit the ball and to field the ball and throw the ball and all that sort of stuff. This is amazing. This is so cool they could do this with sound. I think it's probably one of the reasons I became a perceptual psychologist, is seeing all this kind of cool stuff that sensory impaired individuals could do. It completely got me into the questions of perception, all that sort of thing. These days, I think there's at least 16 teams. I actually haven't checked in a few years, so it could be more. But there are multiple teams in Southern California, just to give you a sense. Orange County has a couple of teams. LA County, Riverside County have teams, which is pretty cool. The players are all visually impaired. They're legally blind at least, and kind of to equalize everyone having to use sound for this, and balance and other things, but not using sight. That's why they're all wearing these blindfolds. So, a lot of people who are legally blind do have some light vision and would potentially be able to see the shadow of a ball coming towards them. So these blindfolds are used to make sure everyone has a fair advantage. One of the cool things is that, the teams are made up of a really wide range of people, both men and women, and ranging from, teenagers who are just learning the sport to folks in their 50s and 60s who've been playing since it was started back in the 1960s. And they all take it very seriously and all are rooting for each other. It's really exciting. Let me show you a little video, and then we'll talk about the rules a little bit to give you a sense of how it works. That's the ball.
you can imagine running full speed in the darkness 100 feet toward a buzzing target. It's at first, if you're doing it for the first time, there's a lot of fear involved.
Willing to sacrifice your body and potentially get hit with a lot, with a ball that's coming at you at a decent speed.
Okay. You saw a little bit of how it's played there. I'm going to go ahead and talk a bit more about the details of how it's played. You heard two types of sounds. You heard the ball going beep, 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 beep. I'll bring my ball next class. My ball is broken. It doesn't work anymore. I've had it forever, and its battery is broken, so it doesn't really beep. It makes some type of sound, but it's very different from the sound that it's supposed to make. But you heard it there. The other thing that makes a sound is the bass. So there are two bases in beep baseball, and they are located roughly where first and third base are located in a regular baseball field. And as you can see, they're big and tall, and they have cushioning in them. And the rules are different in beep baseball. So after the ball is hit by the batter, okay, their job is to run to either the third base or the first base as fast as they can. And they don't know which base is going to make a sound and which base they should therefore run towards until just after they hit the ball. And there's somebody who's working that behind them. So they hit the ball's coming in, beep, beep, beep. They hit the ball, beep, beep, beep. And as soon as they touch the ball, one of the bases, either the one on the right at first base position or the one on the left at third base position, starts buzzing. And their job is to run to the base and hit the base, touch the base, hit the base as quickly as they can and before the outfielder of the other team has possession of the ball. That's what you're seeing here. So as the runner who's just batted the ball, as the batter is running towards the base, they have to get to the base before the outfielder says, I have the ball, I have control of the ball. And if they make it there, they get a run, they get a point. If they don't make it there before the outfielder has the ball, then they're out. Okay, so it's a different type of goal a little bit in terms of how this works. A couple of other things I want to say about this is that there are two-sided people on the team. One is the pitcher, okay, and the other is the catcher. And the pitcher and catcher are on the same team as the batters. So if you've ever played softball, you have younger siblings that have or something like that, you might know that when you're really little, they go through a phase where they play what's called coach pitch softball, where the coach of the team that's batting will pitch the ball so the little kids have a better chance of hitting it, right? They're on the same team as the batters. The idea is to allow them to hit it as easily as possible. That's the purpose of the pitcher in beep baseball. They are on the same team as the batter, and they actually practice with each batter to make sure that they get it in the best position for them to hit the ball. Okay, I see we're out of time here. We'll continue talking about the rules. I'll bring my beep baseball next time. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday.